Morning, class. I'm here to walk you through the first two meditations of René Descartes' major 1640 work, Meditations on First Philosophy, which many scholars and commentators argue inaugurated modernity, the modern period. For the purposes of this first unit of the class, which is centered on the question of selfhood or personal identity, we'll be taking on specifically the first two of the six meditations. Work published 1641. Firstly, what are some motivations for the work? Well, it constitutes a major challenge to the school of thought known as scholasticism. Now, who are the scholastics? These were medieval ecclesiastical and scientific authorities operating in various institutions, the Catholic Church, universities, and so forth. The letter of dedication, which begins the meditations, was dedicated to these authorities in Paris. But the unquestionable, insuperable intellectual authorities, according to the scholastic worldview, are one, the Bible, the scriptural authority of revealed religion, and then also the metaphysics, logic, and epistemology of Aristotle, so the ancient Greek pagan thinker who during the medieval period was appropriated by Christian thinkers, most notably St. Thomas Aquinas. And so Descartes gives us a major challenge to scholasticism, but the challenge is pointed precisely at the Aristotelian source of dominant intellectual authority, not the Bible. However, Descartes has to be quite careful, and you can see the rather gingerly way he approaches those to whom he's offering this work as a work of scientific truth. And that's largely because of the historical moment in which this is unfolding. So less than 10 years prior, famously, Galileo had been put on house arrest for adopting the Copernican, that is, heliocentric model of the universe. So Descartes was being very careful, and kind of hidden, a subtlety in that letter of dedication is a rather, what might be interpreted as an outrageous conceit on the part of Descartes. The truth of God's existence, and that's one of the other motivators. So throughout the six meditations, Descartes is trying to show that mind and body are ultimately distinct, and further, and this is the substance of the second meditation, that mind is more eminently knowable than the body, and also to prove, using, as he puts it, unaided reason alone, that God exists. Now, according to the ecclesiastical authority, one doesn't need to use reason to prove that God exists, because one already knows that God exists because of the revealed truth of that fact in biblical sources. And so Descartes is approaching the authorities of the day and suggesting that he can help to prove the existence of God to rationally oriented, skeptically disposed atheists, right? So this is a work which is supposed to convince atheists, not true believers who don't require any of this difficult philosophical interpretation. But of those two motivations, so proving the distinctness of mind and body, and to prove using unaided reason the existence of God, it's really the first motivation that is of significance for our discussion. So now, what is Descartes' procedure? Well, he takes on what scholars call methodological skepticism. And so this is a skepticism, but it's methodological in the sense that it has a definite end towards which it's oriented. So what he wants to uncover through this procedure is what cannot be doubted, not something that seems so sure, according to our familiar experience, that it's quite difficult to doubt, but something which is so certain that it's not amenable to any degree of doubt whatever. And this will provide what we can refer to as epistemic bedrock, the absolute foundation for all knowledge. And so this is Descartes' assumption that he begins with, even if he claims to take a presuppositionless or assumptionless starting point. He seems to assume epistemological foundationalism, namely that there is some, to use an architectural metaphor, foundational truth without which the remaining structural edifice of knowledge built on top of it would lack any kind of sustainable support and would collapse under its own weight. So Descartes wants to raze to the ground, wants to destroy our received kind of Aristotelian metaphysical and epistemological inheritance and replace the foundation with something firmer. So what is epistemic bedrock? In other words, what is there, if anything, that I cannot doubt? So let's get into the first meditation. Don't trust your senses. So the authority of Aristotelian metaphysics, Aristotle himself being a kind of proto-empiricist. So we'll look at empiricism as one approach within the framework of epistemology alongside a different approach, which Descartes himself pursues, that of rationalism. But we'll examine empiricism in more detail starting next week with David Hume. But Aristotle, being a kind of proto-empiricist, has the view that there is no material with which the intellect or reason can work that hasn't been first supplied through the avenue of the senses, right? So sensory information, if not sensory knowledge, is foundational. According to Descartes, you can't trust your senses. Well, why not? Our senses are a frequent source of illusion. So, for example, there's a stick in the water, it appears visually to be quite bent, but then you reach in and grab it and see that it is straight. If you go into like a head shop that uses black lighting, there are all these sort of trippy posters you can put on your wall, little images that seem to be spiraling, for example, when in fact you're just dealing with a static 2D image. Or, as Descartes gives the example, if you look at the sun, which I don't recommend, by the way, if you look at the sun, it appears to be quite small in size, almost as if you could reach out and grab it, but you can't, it's quite far away. So that's a kind of illusion of the senses, which is brought about by a factor such as spatial distance. So don't trust your senses. We know that if somebody or something has fooled you once, it's not a good idea to trust them ever again. And so here is where Descartes adopts, as any good philosopher does, this approach whereby he poses a challenge and then, using common sense, walks back a bit, retracts the force of that challenge in order to examine the issues more critically. So, can't trust your senses, but can't you kind of trust your senses? Let's not get crazy. Let's not go too far here. So he says, I don't want to seem like one of those people who thinks you're wearing clothes when you're actually nude, or that your entire body is made of glass, or maybe that your head is actually a butternut squash or something like that. That would be insane, right? So maybe our senses are a little bit reliable. But no, you could be dreaming, like right now. You could be in the grip of a very long dream, and of course, we only identify the dreamscape as a dream once we have been released from it, once we return to waking life, and by contrast, we can say, oh, now I'm awake and I was in a dream. And so that whole story, the whole confusing oniric spectacle or drama was all just in my head, right? But while you're in the dream, you can't do that, right? You're in the thick of it, okay? So there's a problem. But going along this approach, pulling back the force of that observation isn't the basic stuff of dreams, such as the colors that make up the content of your dream, the fundamental dimensions that make up a dream space, mathematical truths, and so forth, aren't these things, these primitive notions, derived from real waking life? So for example, even if we're in a dream, can't we affirm the truth that 2 + 2 = 4, right? It's not as if math is completely transformed within a dream. Maybe, but there could be an evil demon putting these false thoughts in your head. So maybe you just think 2 + 2 = 4, but in reality, it equals 8. And the terrifying part about this is, how would you ever know? So we could be, he makes the supposition that there is this, this demon or evil genius, just as powerful as he is manipulative and deceptive, who could very well be positing all sorts of illusory data into your consciousness. And while you're under the sway of this demonic force, you would have absolutely no recourse to adjudicate between fiction and reality. So to conclude the first meditation, maybe Descartes says, all that is certain is that nothing is certain. Remember, in terms of epistemic bedrock, that's precisely what Descartes is after, certainty. For Cartesian epistemology, what counts as genuine knowledge is knowledge that is indubitably true. That is to say, absolutely uncertain. So if the only certainty seems to be that there is no certainty, where does that leave us? That leaves us without foundation, putting us perhaps in an even worse position than we started with, or maybe not. But in any case, it's not the best. That we can't seem to know anything, except maybe the truth that we can't seem to know anything. This isn't where Descartes wants to stop, and this isn't where he stops. Next, meditation 2. Hold on a second. This is how it begins. Taking for granted, as a starting point here where we left off the previous meditation, even if there is an evil demon or genius, we don't want to say God. Again, that could put Descartes in hot water with the church, given the suggestion that if God is deceiving us, deception is itself a mark of evil, and we can't, knowing that God is omnibenevolent, perfectly good, attribute badness to his divine character. So Descartes says, well, maybe there's just this evil demon or genius, pointing also to this notion of a genie, right? They share the same kind of etymology, some kind of mysteriously, spiritually powerful force. But even if there is such an evil demon or genius entirely controlling the content of my thoughts and my ability to think, if we want to go that far, doesn't it still hold true as a necessary consequence of this assumption, of this rather supposition, that if I'm being deceived, I must exist in order to be deceived? So perhaps we know something after all. So this is the end of part 1 of the video. I'll now turn to part 2 and examine the second meditation and Descartes' argument therein in more detail.